That means you share the order, you have two suppliers, and you never create a situation where there is a monopoly in supply. But if you create a sort of single source, what do? You get products of high quality because the inferior you're not taking, and you get also at a cheaper price. This is a short term. That means single source, higher quality, lower price. Two source, slightly higher price and slightly lower average quality. Anybody would prefer to have one which is of higher quality and lesser price. That means the better of the two sources should get all the order. There's an innovative way how people deal with this. If the supply chain has got good trust and the practices are well in use, what usually is done is when one supplier does not get enough orders because of his not ability to produce at low cost or at better quality, the supply chain DMU then starts working on improving the ability of this supplier till the time it is brought to the level of the better supplier. That means that to build reliability in the supply chain, you have to try very hard to make sure that the two sources of supply are same. At least both of them are above a threshold which makes them acceptable to your supply chain. If the supply chain has got good trust and the practices are well in use, what usually is done is when one supplier does not get enough orders because of his not ability to produce at low cost or at better quality, the supply chain DMU then starts working on improving the ability of this supplier till the time it is brought to the level of the better supplier. That means that to build reliability in the supply chain, you have to try very hard to make sure that the two sources of supply are same. At least both of them are above a threshold which makes them acceptable to your supply chain. Now this is not done from the point of view of making the supply chain reliable in the near future. This is done to make the supply chain reliable for the future. That means as the product design changes, your supplier should have enough capability to produce a higher quality product. So it can happen that at one point in time, one of the supplier loses an order, but he is not thrown out of the supply chain. He is still kept in the supply chain and constantly engaged with so that his processes improve. This is a big departure from what we see, because few years ago it was known that in Japan, one item code was sourced from only one supplier. This was contrary to what was being understood in the rest of the world. What was being understood in the rest of the world was that to increase the reliability of the supply chain, you have to make sure that you have enough security, and that would mean that you should have a backup. That means your supply source should be more than one. Otherwise, the negotiating power of the supplier goes up. And here in Japan, there was a practice evolving where one item code was sourced from one supplier. But then how did the Japanese build the reliability in supply? This was in case there was a problem with this supplier, They had another supplier now capable of producing the same item with the same quality. But the efforts of this improvement were only used if the current source was at risk or got disrupted. The first attempt was always being made to increase the reliability of the current supplier. That means all the elements of risk in supply were constantly assessed and reduced. This aspect played out when Honda had a severe shortage in supply because of the earthquake. There were single source suppliers, very reliable in normal conditions, but under the acts of nature, they were not able to sustain. But on the other side, this practice has also made huge progress in Japan, and the supply chains were very reliable. There are many aspects, many parts in a supply chain which are actually monopoly of one supplier. And the reason why it's a monopoly, because the person holds some unique proprietary to that product. This also forces many supply chains not to develop an alternate source. The reliability of the supply chain is often developed by not only one aspect. One has to look at many aspects to increase the reliability. And what I mean by many aspects is, though we cannot have two sources, you're going to have only one source. What are you going to do to make sure this one source always performs? The involvement of the OEMs or the purchaser with this source goes up many levels. So the OEMs constantly share their expansion plan with the person. They constantly keep giving feedback that the deliveries have to be done at this level. And they also constantly make sure that they are financially very clear in understanding the result of this company which is working. When I said financial performance of this supplier actually is supposed to bear open how the supplier is working. There are many times in our automobile industry where the supplier got so well integrated into the supply chain of the OEM that over a period of time they practically became one. But the supplier's margins reduced. He did not make a loss, but the supplier margins reduced. And when the margins reduce, the ability to manage an operation becomes the key driver and a very important factor. And if during this time there is a change in management, the new management may not find the profit margins worth investing their time in. They may decide to sell it. They may decide to shut it down because the return on capital is not good enough. Though they are promised certain amount of profits over a long period of time, because now they are so well entrenched in the supply chain that the profits are guaranteed, but they're not good enough. Now this particular supplier now wants to exit. Traditionally, Japanese supply chains have managed to make such a beautiful cross-holding that any important technology or a supplier gets enough protection in financial terms that it never faces a crunch. However, the exit also is equally tough because the ownership is such nicely interlinked and webbed that the supplier lands up being caught in the supply chain, or many tier 1, tier 2 suppliers own this unique manufacturer. So now in a situation where you are a very important supplier and you are a single source and you want to exit, how does the supply chain make sure that the reliability of supply happens? This is where the trust in supply chain comes into play. Many times the OEM themselves buy out this unique supplier to make sure that the supply does not get disrupted. It can also happen that not only this, many other suppliers, because of the other related practices, face financial issues. They often get some relief or support from the original equipment manufacturer, not in terms of loans or something, but in terms of slightly easier credit terms. To make sure that the reliability of supply remains, supply chains actually need to treat most of the associated manufacturers as suppliers, not as vendors. Vendors can be dealt with by a purchasing department. But when we talk about suppliers, we know that so many other aspects get into place. The DME comes into place, and here, if there's a financial stress and is a very important supplier, the OEMs come down to secure the financial stability of the supplier and then later on maybe sell it off to somebody else. But once in financial stress, it is not easy for this unique supplier in this supply chain to just go and make an open bid. The exit route out of the supply chains is also equally tough, because by now your tier 1 or the OEM has invested very heavily in your processes, and the technology that you're using has also been shared, controlled and improved by the investment of the manpower of the OEMs. This is how a supply chain stabilizes or assures that there is a reliability in supply. Having one supplier or having two suppliers in its essence does not make the supply very stable. And decision-making units are constantly in play to make sure that the supply is reliable. The decision-making unit very frequently deals with 4 aspects of quality, technology, delivery, and cost. But a long-term relationship in a supply chain can also make the buyer or the OEM get involved with you from the financial aspect of it. And this is what makes the Japanese supply chain very unique. The holdings of the companies in a Japanese supply chain make their supply chain unique.